It's important to make the right decisions, like when to go for it on fourth down, or when to kick the field goal or go for the touchdown. It's also important to make the right insurance decisions, too. That's why my office, Trey McAdams State Farm, is here to help you select the right protection at the right price. Our office will make sure you understand your State Farm coverages, so you'll know what to expect when the unexpected happens. With Trey McAdams State Farm, it's easy to make the right call. When you want the real deal, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Proud sponsor of the Tennessee Vols.
Following the 78-73 loss to the Kentucky Wildcats, Rick Barnes after the game says, I don't think Kentucky was the least bit concerned with what we were doing from the three-point line. And when they go 11-45, Jimmy, from the perimeter, I think it shows you just that they were not worried about Tennessee's perimeter presence. But how much of a concern is that for you when you look to the rest of the SEC play and they just cannot find their three-point shot so far?
It's a huge concern. Remember what they did at Auburn.
Yeah.
They were 0 for 11 in the first half from three-point range against Auburn. They were 0 for 14 in the first half from three-point range against Florida. This is not a very good shooting team. Now, I know Rick Barnes afterwards said, hey, I think we can shoot it well, but you're 11 out of 45. At one point, you were 5 of 25. Now, he did say that he didn't feel like they forced any threes until late in the game. But still, this is not a real good shooting team. There was only one player that really shot well from outside, and that was Igor Milicic.
Yeah.
And he was 4 out of 8, and he ended up leading the team with 19 points. But I actually thought he was the only player for Tennessee that played well against Kentucky. But Kentucky packed it in and said, hey, if you want to take a bunch of threes, we'll challenge you on that. And Tennessee wasn't up to the challenge.
Yeah, we'll talk about Igor Milicic in just a moment. That'll be our second takeaway from this unfortunate loss, if you could call it that. So what you're mentioning with the three-point defense from Kentucky, it's like you're not making any shots and they're going to continue to give you more and more space, and that's exactly what they did. And that's what we saw in those final minutes, really last 70 seconds of the game, where they were 1 of 7 from the three-point line. A lot of that, 4 of it came in one possession where Chaz Lanier got the fourth look. He did sink the triple try from the top of the arc, but Kentucky was not really concerned with what they were doing. That took from about the 110 mark all the way down to about the 30 mark. So he took really, truly the full shot clock after all of those rebounds to get it done. I think that's your greatest concern, that we can't get Chaz Lanier going. It's another game where they're off to a very slow offensive start, and they're not really ever able to get the engine going until maybe the last 5 minutes of the game.
Yeah, and that was a struggle. Now, and actually from the beginning of the game, Rick Barnes said his defense didn't show the intensity that it needed. But offensively, they weren't sharp. They weren't sharp at all, and they had a few spurts. They clicked on, I think at one point they did hit 3 out of 4 threes, but for the most part, they shot poorly. And Rick Barnes said one of the things he was most disappointed about was lack of intensity on defense at the start of the game, where they gave up some backdoor cuts and some layups and didn't perform very well there. Here's the other part of that, too. Tennessee entered as the #1 three-point defense in the country, and Kentucky was 12 out of 24. When you look at the stats, Kentucky shoots 50% from 3, 50% overall. It's amazing that Tennessee was even in the game as poorly as the Vols shot.
And it was much more staggering than that, really, up until the midway of the second half, when they were en route to a 62.6% clip from the three-point line. Their first 6 attempts, 5 of them were three-pointers to start the game. They made 4 of them. So it definitely slowed down a little bit into the second half with what Tennessee was able to do adjustment-wise. You mentioned those backdoor cuts and driving the lane. That's the balance for Tennessee. You're going up against a Kentucky team that loves to drive the ball to the rim, but then you have to decide if I'm going to crowd the paint and I'm going to leave the three-point shot wide open. And he says it's not the three-pointer that killed us tonight, really, because they only had 1 more make against Tennessee. They had 12. Tennessee had 11, but it's what they were able to do in the paint.
I'll differ a little on that. When somebody's 12 out of 24 on threes, that's a huge difference. And I know, look, and they took, 20 fewer three-point attempts?
Yeah.
And made 1 more. That's a huge difference in the shooting and the overall shooting as well. So I do think when you've got the best three-point defense in the country and the team shoots 50%, that's not very good. And you shot extremely poor from that range. Look, Tennessee came in as an 11-point favorite against Kentucky, and Kentucky had twice given up 100 points this year in a game. Once to Florida, once to Alabama, and yet defensively it's like, boy, why is Tennessee unable to score against this defense, which really isn't that good?
No.
So it was a lot of that, and Rick Barnes said it. He said offensively Tennessee shot itself in the foot quite a bit, and I would agree with that.
Yeah, and he was most disappointed because after coming off of that Auburn game where their defense absolutely kept them in this game, and that's where he was most proud of the team. They lacked all of that defensive focus for a majority of the game. But who had the focus? You mentioned it earlier with Igor Milicic Jr. I believe into the game with 4 threes on the night. I think he finished 4 of 8 from the three-point line, which is a season high for Igor. He has a career best 5 when he was at Charlotte taking on Davidson in November of 2023. He also had 3 of course, tonight. So it's really his best night from the three-point line, where he's had 5, maybe, 5 other times this season. But he really had the best focus and effort tonight.
He did. He played best for Tennessee out of all the players, and the only one that I thought really played well. I mean, Ziegler was 1 out of 11 on threes. He tweaked his knee with about 2 minutes left in the first half, and he came back. And even Rick Barnes said that he didn't notice a difference in Ziegler's play in the second half. Ziegler just had a bad night shooting from outside, as did most of his teammates. So it was just a really rough night, Tennessee shooting, and I was really surprised with that. I've been surprised by this team as far as the slumps they go into when they shoot from outside. I thought this would be a much better shooting team. And here's another stat that's kind of interesting, Paige. Going into the SEC, there were 7 games that Tennessee's played. 4 starters are shooting less than 40% from the field. How does that compare to Kentucky? Kentucky has 4 starters shooting over 44% from the field, and 3 of them are shooting over 50%. That just tells you the kind of struggles Tennessee has had shooting the basketball.
I think a lot of that, too, with the struggles of shooting the basketball, especially from the three-point line, not only does Rick Barnes maybe say, like, oh, we don't have enough good shooters to be able to do that, but what upsets him most is when they're taking the looks as if they're a little bit rushed, because he says oftentimes when they're taking these threes, they're not in the right spot in the post to help get rebounds or go get out-of-area rebounds, which doesn't give them a chance to get a second chance points, and it's a quick, defensive rebound for your opponent. And he says that's the most frustrating part, that they're taking these threes without reason.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, about Tennessee, the other games we mentioned where they had trouble shooting the ball, Auburn and Florida, both of those are on the road. Tennessee actually had been a pretty decent three-point shooting team at home. But if you look at, now I don't know what the stats are right now, but in their 7 SEC games, they were shooting less than 32% from three-point range. They have got to do better in that regard, and they can't just have one guy that's a threat from outside like Milicic was tonight. Nobody else was hitting much of anything. They've got to have more than that from the outside. And as Rick Barnes said about why didn't you score inside? Well, they can't score if you're not touching the ball. So Tennessee didn't do a very good job of getting it inside to either Phillips or to Felix Akpor.
Yeah, well, those are our takeaways following another upsetting loss, especially here at home. But there's just 4 losses on the year now, so they're not a bad team, but they definitely have got to figure it out.
That sounds like what Coach Barnes said.
That's exactly what he said. Not a bad team, but they could be a better team, not living up to their potential yet. We'll be back later this week to talk more about Tennessee Lady Vols and Vol basketball part 2 with Bob Kessling and Jimmy Himes talking about his final go calling Tennessee basketball. We'll talk to you later this week.